This is the second scene. Uh, First scene was recorded about an hour ago. This is June the 5th, 2024. Uh, I left off on the other scene when we moved to the farm, and that was in 1944, in May, as I recall. Dad had decided that he had to quit teaching, being he had a master's degree, had been superintendent at two different schools for about 10 years, and I still have a book where he recorded his assets and liabilities. And this would be when he was 40 years old, since he was born in 1904, and this was recorded in 1944. And in this book, he listed his assets down to a radio. And when he compiled all of his assets and liabilities, he figured his net worth was minus $10. So he decided, I've got to do something other than be a teacher or administrator. So his father, Henry Newberry, and mother, Exie Newberry, were at retirement age, and so they decided to sell their farm and move to Hollis. And Dad bought the farm. And so the farm that my grandfather had was as a result of him coming to Oklahoma in 1900 from Greenville, Tennessee, along with his cousin Tom. So the two of them took a train from Tennessee to Palma, Texas, bought horses and other stuff, and rode up to this place in which is now Harmon County to file a claim for 160 acres each for homesteading. The land had just recently been opened up for homesteading by the government. It wasn't occupied by the Indians as a lot of the other parts of Oklahoma were. So they were obligated to make a house and live and work the land for a period of a year or so in order to be entitled to own the land. And it was allocated at 160 acres. So to have a place to live, they had to dig a hole in the ground, a dugout, and they would put a wooden structure on top of that hole. The wooden structure was only about 4 or 5 foot tall with a roof on it, and that's where he lived from 1900 until 1902 or 3. So my grandfather Newberry had been a Civil War veteran, not a Civil War veteran, a Spanish-American veteran, and he had served in that for 2 years. And he went to out of his high school, he went to a small college at Tecumseh for 2 years. So there he was at about 22 years old, He was born in 1875, so he would have been closer to 25 years old when he went to the farm to develop a homestead. So, since he had some education, he was able to get a job teaching school. And he taught school for several years in a little village called Hester, which was about 15 miles to the east of his homestead. And so with that, and his cousin had built a small store on the land that he had homesteaded adjacent to my grandfather's, where a post office was established by a man by the name of Schroeder, hence the name of the town or the village or whatever name you want to give the small community. Schroeder was given to him, since the man that started the post office put his name in. Otherwise, the town should have been called Newberry, since it was built on our land, or what became our land. So, with this post office established by his cousin running the store, my grandfather became a rural mail carrier, and he continued to do that for maybe 10 years or more. So in that way, he was able to accumulate some money to buy out his neighbors who weren't able to survive during the lean years when 160 acres wasn't enough to make a living on. And in that way, my grandfather accumulated around 660 acres of land when he retired in 1944. And my father had previously bought land not too far away, and so the total farm size was 990 acres when we moved to the farm, which is a fair-sized farm for back in those days. My grandfather was very industrious and a very smart man, as was my grandmother Exie. They built a two-room house adjacent to the dugout, where when Exie and Henry got married in 1903, that they lived until about 1910. And in 1910, they built a house across the street, which was purchased as a kit from Sears Roebuck. And grandmother Newberry, Exie, was living with her family, her mother and her brothers and sisters, on a farm that they had homesteaded a mile away. And that's where Exie and Henry met, there at the store. So, this was in 1900. Exie was about 8 or 10 years younger than Henry. And Henry was around 28 and she was around 18. And they had 5 children, 2 girls and 3 boys. And they built this house from this Sears kit with the assistance of Exy's two brothers, who were very skilled at carpentry work. And it was a big house, and it was really the best house around for the whole community, for miles around. It had two large living areas. It was a two-story house, and it had 2 bedrooms and a bath, and a large kitchen and pantry, and adjacent porch in the front and the back. And upstairs it had 4 bedrooms. So all the kids had their own bedrooms, and since there was 5 kids, and so it took a larger house. This is the house that I grew up in from 1944 to 1953. So when we got to the farm, Dad hadn't been on the farm doing farm work since he left home when he was 18. And now he was 40 years old. Well, he found out real fast when he was out in the cotton field in the July heat that cultivating cotton and that it was tough like he had forgotten about. And he found himself out in the field one day pulling what they called goat heads, which were weeds, out of a cultivator, and this man came out into the field and said, "Earl, I'd like for you to come and teach school for me." And it was the superintendent of a local school. And so Dad said, "I think I'll do that. I'll hire somebody else to do this work, and I'll teach." And so Dad began teaching again, and he taught throughout his lifetime until retirement in 1969, teaching in various schools around in the community. I might mention that back in the 1920s, when Dad was teaching in Gould, he was a coach, and he was a principal there in Gould schools. And Dad was a good coach. His teams won many tournaments. In fact, got to the finals in the state basketball. He coached football, baseball, basketball. He started a band in the school at Gould. He was very innovative in things he did with the Gould schools. And he has been recognized as a member of the Gould Alumni Hall of Fame because of his many contributions there, as I was later honored in 2007 in that time period for my accomplishments. The farm was one that raised wheat, cotton, alfalfa, sudan, those kinds of things. We raised all of our basically all of our food there. We had chickens and cows and cattle, and we milked cows, and we had pigs, and we had sheep, and so we had an abundance of meat for our meals. I can't ever recall having a meal without meat. We also always had a big garden in front of the house. And Mother would can vegetables, and people back then did all of that. The only thing they bought at the grocery store was things like flour and sugar and things of that nature. And so we'd rent a big freezer box in the town of Gould to store the cattle and the pigs and things of that nature for future use. Then we had, back in the days when I grew up on the farm, we pulled cotton. That is, you pulled the bolls off of the cotton stalk. The term cotton picking came from prior years when the gins weren't able to remove the burrs, the cotton burrs. So people back in the 1800s, early 1900s, had to pick the cotton, and that meant just pulling the cotton out of the boll. So as soon as we got to the farm, everybody, all farm kids, pulled bolls. In fact, the schools would start in July and go until sometime around September, and then would let out for about 6 weeks for cotton pulling time, because all the kids were needed to be on the farm and pull the cotton. And because mechanized cotton pulling didn't come about until very rudimentary machinery in the late 40s, and not really truly mechanized until sometime in the latter 50s, early 60s. So from 1944 until I was old enough to drive tractors, I would pull cotton, which wasn't much fun, because to pull cotton, you pulled a sack where you threw the cotton in as you walked along, stooped down, pulling the cotton and throwing it into the bag. And you did this all day long until and the days were like 10 hours long. So with the sack, you pull that, the sack was about 10 to 14 feet long, and by the time you got it full, it weighed some 80 pounds or so, and you had to pull that while you were pulling your cotton, and then you had to carry it to the wagon where the cotton was weighed to determine how much you got paid for pulling the cotton. Well, we didn't get paid while we were pulling our own cotton. So, but when we got our cotton pulled, excuse me, that wasn't the end of our work, because we had to go pull cotton for our neighbors. And so we would walk across the pasture and pull cotton for Carlos Hall. And then when that was done, we would go and pull cotton for other neighbors. One of them was R.D. and Dorothy Cornett, who lived in the house where Exie had lived when they homesteaded. And so one time my brother and I, John, were pulling cotton for the Cornetts, and we finished pulling for them, and we decided, you know, we could walk home, which was about a mile away, or we could call Mom and ask her to drive over and pick us up. But the problem with calling Mother was it was a party line, and that meant that as a party line on telephones, anybody could pick up a receiver on their wall phone and listen in and talk on the phone. And so there were about 10 people on the party line. So we were lazy, and we decided we'd take a chance and we'd call Mom, because what we were concerned about was one of those people getting on the party line and telling Mom that they had cotton to pull. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. When we got on the phone with Mom, this lady across the road says, "Well, Verl, we've got our cotton to pull if they want to come over here." So Mom says, "Y'all go over there and pull cotton." Well, it was about noon. We weren't happy about this at all. And so we decided we're not going to pull cotton this afternoon. Let's play sick. And so we called up and told our parents we were sick. Both of it? Yeah, both of us. It must have been something we ate for lunch. And so they came and got us. Well, Dad could tell right off that we weren't sick. We were pretending. And he says, "You upset stomach, huh?" "Yeah, Dad, upset stomach." "Well, I've got the cure for that. A little bit of castor oil and black broth will take care of you good. The black broth gave you diarrhea, and the castor oil was the remedy for anything, and it was horrible tasty, and it also gave you diarrhea." We weren't about to admit that we'd lied, so we took it and suffered the consequences. So, I was happy when I was old enough to drive a tractor, and I do remember I was 12 years old when I started driving a tractor. And since I was able to drive a tractor, I no longer had to pull cotton. I raised a lot of pigs while I was on the farm, Chester Whites, and I had show pigs, and they won many ribbons. And I was able to raise quite a few of them, and I made quite a bit of money in my high school years raising the pigs. In fact, I got the herd up to about 70 or so, and I sold them all and decided to lease a quarter section of land and buy cattle and put on that land and make money for my college. So I bought about 40 head of cattle and put them on the land that I'd rented close by, and the drought hit. and the grass dried up. And before I could get them vaccinated for blackleg, a couple of them died from that. And then the price went down. I didn't have anything to feed them. I had to sell them at a loss, and I lost all of my money. So, that was my first experience of being a farmer and seeing the ups and downs of farming. As I mentioned, we had cows. That meant we had to milk morning and night, twice a day. You had to round up the cattle in the evening and go down and milk them in winter time when it was freezing cold, and we would milk about a dozen or more cows, and they would sell the milk to this, what we call a creamery, which would have a truck come by every day and pick up the milk in 10-gallon cans. So that was very tough. Just you always had to do something. There was pigs and chickens to feed, cattle to take care of, fences to build, always something to do on the farm. Breaking up ice when the winter, when it was too cold for the cattle to have feed, you had to go, we had a silo where we had feed, where we spread it out for the cattle. Always some kind of work to do. Chicken eggs to pick up. It was, I remember when we were only about 10 or 11, we decided we would take some of the eggs that some of the hens had laid that my parents didn't know anything about, that they hadn't laid them in their nest. They laid them somewhere else that we found. And we took those eggs and walked to the Schroeder store, which was half a mile away, and we'd trade like 2 or 3 eggs for a soda pop and a candy bar. We didn't tell our parents about that until much later. The farm life was a very hard life from the standpoint of there was always work. We worked before school, after school, on Saturdays. We didn't work on Sundays. My parents were very religious. The only time we would ever work on Sundays was when harvest was on and we had to get the crop in, and that was very limited time. Our tractors and implements to plow were very, very small in relation to tractors later on. The tractors were, we had 3 or 4 tractors, and we would keep them all running, my 2 brothers and I and Dad. Sometimes we would take several days with 3 tractors plowing with one-way plows that were only 8 foot wide, and it would take us several days to plow 160 acres. So in today's time, of course, you can pull in with equipment today and have that plowed within a few hours. So it was, since we had all this land, it was always busy. particularly hard work was uh, hay baling time, in which the hay balers put out uh, bales that were uh, weighed about 60 to 80 pounds apiece, alfalfa hay. And we hired other people who owned the baling equipment to bale it, and then it was us boys' job to drive a truck out in the field and load the truck, throw bales up on the truck bed, and then we'd take that to our barn, and we had a loft in the barn where we'd toss these bales up into the loft and stack it in there for feeding the cattle later on. We had, when we got to the farm, we had a need for a horse, and Dad went to the sale barn in Hollis and bought this horse for $25. And it was a young horse, hadn't been broke, and he also bought a saddle for $35. And since this was 1945, and us boys were too young to break the horse, that is, to teach it to let us ride it. So we had this neighbor who was 18 or 19 years old, and he came down and rode the horse enough to where it tamed down and it would let people get on it and ride it. So it wasn't really accustomed to people riding it, and I didn't know any better, and so my first attempt to ride it, I jumped on it and somehow or another managed to scare it, and it took off running through the pasture, and the pasture was full of mesquite trees, and I didn't know how to tell it to stop, and so I just hunkered down and laid down, dodged the mesquites as it ran, and it ran for a half a mile before it finally reached a fence and stopped. So that was my first experience of riding a horse. His name was Prince, and that was our transportation until we got old enough to get a car. And the car we got was we bought 2 Model A's that had been junked, my brother John and I. John was, I was about 14 or 15, and John would be about 16 or 17. And John was very good mechanically. I like to think I am too, but I was never as good as John. Growing up, I was always John's, what we call a step and fetch it. He did the actual brain work. I did the grunt work. But again, I was about 14 and he was about 16 or 17, and paid $25 for each of these 2 Model A's that had been junked and weren't running. And we salvaged one and made one that would run out of the 2 of them. And we had a lot of fun with those old Model A's running around the countryside. And Model A's had this thing when you started them where you push the lever and advance what they call the spark, which would assist in getting it started. Well, we found out that after it was running, if you move this lever which advanced to the distributor, it would fire at the wrong time, and that would cause what they call a backfire. And a backfire would be like shooting a shotgun. It was just an explosion that made a big noise. We didn't have a muffler on the old Model A's, so it would really make a big noise. And so we thought it'd be great fun to go to town and do that about midnight. Wake people up. And we did one time and then thought better of it and never did it again. I don't know if anybody ever knew it was us or not. But we made our own entertainment. Before that we had a little scooter that we had bought. We bought the scooter body, which was just a basic tubular frame with a seat and two wheels. And we found an old, what they call a Maytag motor, which was a motor used on Maytag washing machines. It was a single cylinder, didn't have very much power, very basic. And we rigged that up to where it would be a motor for our little scooter. And it didn't have enough power to get going, and you'd have to put it on an incline to get it going. And but once we got it going, it would move right along. Had a lot of fun with that. Again, you made your own fun. There was you were out there on the farm by yourself and had your own devices to do whatever you could when you had some time off. All three boys drove the school bus for the girls' schools. It was common practice back in the 40s and 50s for school-age kids, juniors and seniors in high school, to drive the school bus. And the pay was $25 a month. And so my older brother John, drove the school bus first, and I knew that once he graduated, I would be in line to be the school bus driver after him. And so I took a school bus training program, and sure enough, I drove the school bus in my junior and senior years in school. Got $25 a month for that. And I was even driving a school bus as a substitute for my brother when I was 15 years old. Well, along with that came the responsibility of keeping the bus clean. So you were happy though to drive the bus, because $25 back in 1950s was enough to provide you with some spending money. I refer to my notes to see what I'm you know, these days we have a lot of presents at Christmas, but growing up on the farm, holidays weren't big things. We would get some firecrackers for the 4th of July, but that was the only thing that we had out on. That was the only fireworks that we had, was the ones we threw on the farm ourselves. The other holidays, we didn't know what it was to celebrate New Year's. I don't really remember anything about Thanksgiving, and I'm sure we had big meal, but I don't remember anything. And our Christmas, we always had Christmas, but not very many gifts like we are inclined today to have. My memory of Christmas gifts was we were really having a hard time on the farm at one point in time, and I got one gift for Christmas, and it wasn't much, and I made the mistake of complaining to my mother, and she said, "You're lucky to get that." But most of the Christmases were good. My recollection of them was that they would give us the Sears catalog, which was the go-to thing for buying anything other than local. And they would allocate us some money, and we could choose whatever toys that we wanted from the catalog within that price range. I remember one time my brother John liked to make model airplanes, and he was very good at it. And he made a model airplane for me for my birthday present, and it had a motor, and you flew it by wire. You didn't have a radio control. So he was going to show me how to operate it, and I was out on the front yard, and he started the plane up, and he got it up in the air, and he's showing me how to make it do different things, and then he got too low and came down and hit a solid object that just tore it all to pieces. And he says, "Well, Max, there's your birthday present." I remember the combining wheat. Back when we initially went to the farm, the only combine we had was one that was pulled by a tractor and was only about 5 or 6 feet wide. A very small tractor, and it took forever to harvest wheat with it. And then about 1950, late 40s, combines got much bigger, but they were still the type that you pulled behind a tractor, and it required driving the tractor. You had to drive the tractor and then reach behind to the combine that you were pulling and pull a lever to raise and lower the auger of the combine where the wheat went in. So my dad figured out since we had so much rolling land, it was difficult to drive the tractor and adjust the auger. So my dad figured out how to put a seat up on top of the combine and put a lever up there where he would sit and adjust the auger while I drove the tractor. Well, when you were driving a tractor, you had to be very careful when you came upon a group of weeds, or the wheat was particularly thick, because it would choke up the combine, and all of that going in at one time, the machinery would just stop and cease, and that meant getting down and opening up the combine cover and manually pulling out whatever had stopped up the combine. And I remember doing that one time. I ran into this bunch of weeds and didn't slow down, and choked it up, and my dad was very upset with me. He climbed down off of the combine, opened up the cover. I'm standing there watching it, feeling helpless, and he grabbed a bunch of weeds and stuff from there and looked at me and threw the stuff at me. Oh boy, what memories. See what else I'm missing. We raised a lot of cattle, and one of the types of cattle we raised was what they called Brangus. And it was 3/8 Brahma and 5/8 Angus black cattle. And Dad started a good herd of that. And then in the 1950s, early 50s, a big drought hit, and we didn't get rain for a couple of years, any to speak of. And Dad had to sell those cattle at a loss because there was no feed for them. And that was the same time that I was getting ready to graduate from college, or from high school to go to college. And Dad was terribly in debt, didn't have any money to send me to college, and he and Mom were discussing how they were going to be able to send me to college. And Mom said, well, maybe we shouldn't send him. Dad said, no, we're going to get him there one way or another. And they applied for a hardship scholarship. They qualified for it, that's for sure. Which, back in those days, there weren't hardly any scholarships. And this scholarship paid for the first semester's tuition, and which was only $66. But we were just tickled to get it, because it's $66 we didn't have. And my dad said, now Max, when you get to college, you be sure and thank President Wilhelm for that scholarship. Oh, I said, I will, Dad. Well, several months went by and I hadn't done anything about that. I didn't know how to go about going to a president of the university and thanking him. So it bothered me, but one day I'm walking up the steps of the student union and Dr. Wilhelm is walking down, and I stuck out my hand and I said, Dr. Wilhelm, I want to thank you for the scholarship you gave me. And he I could tell it kind of took him aback, and he recovered real fast, and he says, well, you're welcome, son. Of course, he didn't know what I was talking about. But in order to fund the college, uh, my Aunt Kate had known some doctors who had a need for somebody to be a janitor for their clinic, where 5 of them had offices. And so I went to college working as a janitor for these doctors, and paid 75 cents an hour, which was good wages for then. I mean, it was half again as much as the 50 cents an hour you could get working for the college as a janitor. So I worked at that for a couple of years to pay my way through, because my parents didn't have any money. They were struggling to get by because of the drought. We always had dogs on the farm. Uh, you never forget your dogs. The first one was Tippy, who was an excellent farm dog, and would round up the cattle on his own. And we got Tippy from our grandparents. They left him on the farm. And we also had a dog by the name of Sandy. And so I remember we always had fences built, and later on when we started putting up electric wire fences, and the electric fences was a single wire running around, which was powered by a portable device which operated off a battery, and it would send out a shock, not much current, but high voltage, and it would really it would really hurt when it hit you. And so anytime you set it up, you had to make sure it was working right. Well, there wasn't any kind of testers to do that, so the only way you did it was to grab a hold of the wire and get a shock. So Dad and I were out installing this electric fence, and we got the job finished, and I'm waiting to see what he's going to do about testing it. And he says, "Max, if you will grab a hold of that wire and hold on to it for, I count to 3, I'll buy you a soda pop and a candy bar." I said, "Yeah, great." So I know this machine that sends the shock out works clicked, and when it goes clicked, that means that it is sending out a shock. Well, it takes about 4 seconds for that to click. It clicks about every 4 seconds. So I'm timing it, and as soon as it goes click, I grab a hold of the wire, and Dad goes 1, 2, and I think I got it made, and then he gives me a slow count on 3. He outsmarted me, and I didn't get my Coke and candy bar. When in southwest Oklahoma, the temperature during the summer months would always be in the upper 90s, and most of the time into the hundreds, and it was miserably hot. I remember when you out in the field, you just be so hot you'd hope a cloud would come overhead to give you a little bit of relief. When we'd all come in to the farmhouse for lunch. Mom always had a big lunch. In fact, all three of our meals were big because we worked so much. We ate a lot, but still were very thin. And after lunch, Dad would like to relax and take a nap. And our air conditioning at that time worked very good, but it wasn't the kind of air conditioner we have these days. It was what we call evaporative air conditioning, and that was where you had a box with water running mounted on the outside of your house, with water dripping down on what they call excelsior, which is ground up wood, which retained the moisture. And it had a fan which would pull the air through that excelsior, moisture-laden excelsior, and that would evaporate, and that would cool down the air to really nice, cool air. And we're talking going down into the 70s, and it was nice with that breeze in 70, and it was felt so good. And we'd all lay down in front of that air conditioner in the living area and try to be very quiet so Dad wouldn't wake up and we could lay there a bit longer. It usually didn't work very well. We had, in our cotton fields, Dad would always put watermelon seeds in with the cotton seed, so that at cotton pulling time we always had a lot of watermelons, and they were so plentiful that we would eat them out in the field. We would simply take the watermelon and drop it and break it open and eat what they call the heart out, the middle of it. And we really spoiled with all our watermelons. We had, in Oklahoma back then, of course there wasn't any TV, there wasn't any real weather coverage. The only way you knew that you were going to have a severe storm was to look out in the sky. And we depended on Dad at night for that. We were upstairs and we'd hear the thunder and lightning and all the rest. We didn't worry because we knew Dad was looking out. Didn't realize how dark it was and that he couldn't really see a tornado if it was coming. But we did have a cellar adjacent to the house where we went every once in a while when Dad thought that the tornadoes were a very good possibility. In high school, or in school, I started at dual school when I was in 4th grade, and the school then had 3 buildings, and the first building was the gym with grade school, where you went from 1st through 4th to 5th grade, and then the middle school was where you went from your 6th through 9th grade, and then the high school was 10th through 12th grade. And we had excellent teachers. A lot of the teachers were local people who had got their degree and decided to stay there in the local community and probably farm on the side because teachers' pay wasn't that great and they had to do extra work during the summer and other times to make ends meet. or be married to another school teacher. Uh, we were, when we were in our ninth grade, we were quite about 14 or 15 years old, and really mischievous group. There was only 10 people in my class, and only 2 girls. And our boys, at least 4 or 5 of us, had a mischievous streak. We got bored with school, and to entertain ourselves, we would act up and do silly things and aggravate the teachers. And back then, teachers didn't like what you were doing. They pulled out the paddle and laid it to you. And so we decided that whippings didn't hurt that much, and we wanted to have fun. And we decided that we'd see who could get the most licks, whips, and just as a contest. And I wasn't as mischievous as 2 or 3 of the others were. They were way ahead of me in the number of whacks they'd gotten. But the principal found out that we had this game going, and that was why we were acting up so much, just as for bragging rights for getting the most licks. And so he called us together and said, new rules. There will be no more whippings anymore. And really, yeah, from now on, if any of you guys act up, you don't get to go out for baseball. Oh, jeez, that really got our attention. So we were little angels from then on. When in our school, it was a rather small school, Gould was. In fact, it had to close down in 1990 because of declining population in the county. And we only had 10 in my graduating class. But so the offerings for school subjects was therefore limited. We did have 2 courses in algebra and 1 in geometry, and I believe 1 in trigonometry and 1 in biology. But other than English, we had typing as a subject, and history. You had to have Oklahoma history. But every boy basically took vocational agriculture, and it was either that or home economics, which all the girls took. And so that was one of our, it was the only option we had, either take vocational agriculture or home economics. So naturally I took vocational agriculture, and I was they had a where we showed our cattle and our pigs and things of that nature at the county shows and the state fairs. I won ribbons in all of those, and we also had a thing called Future Farmers of America, where you can try to get state farmer, and that was as high as you could go as far as recognition. You had to have farmed so many acres, have so many shows, ribbons. You had to have a certain amount of income from your farming. You had to put together a scrapbook to show all of this. You had to be an officer in your chapter, and I was president of my chapter, and as were my brother John and Joe, chapter presidents of their chapter, and both of them and I were the state farmers, chapter farmers, which is very unusual. And in my class of only 7 or 8 boys, 4 of us were made that, which is unheard of for a small school like that. It never happened again. So I used to really enjoy our trips to Oklahoma City to the state fairs, where we would show our cattle and our pigs, things of that nature. It gave us 3 or 4 days where we could experience the big city life, eating some of the nice restaurants, and have a real enjoyable time for country folks. As I mentioned, times were hard on the farm because of the drought. Although we operated a very large farm, that meant that when things went bad as far as prices or lack of rain, we suffered the most, the bigger farmers. And even though it looked like, because we lived in a big house and had a lot of land, it looked like we were prosperous. My parents were very, very concerned about whether they could continue keeping the farm. But we lived well, ate good, enjoyed life, but it was tough times on the farm until the rains and prices started coming back up in the mid to later 50s. So that's some of my memories of the difficulties Dad faced on the farm. We always had visits from our city cousins. We had cousins from Tulsa and Electra and other places that they come and visit during the summer when their school was out, and they could have fun with us and enjoy the farm. They always talked about how they truly enjoyed that, and we enjoyed their company and teach them what it's like to live on a farm. Well, I think that's probably the most I want to cover for this scene. We'll stop the recording and get it going again in another day.